The Sega Genesis, aka Mega Drive, changed gaming forever when it came out. It just did. We were all playing 8-bit systems at the time. Nintendo was great, but when the Sega Genesis came out, I mean, it blew our minds. I have a lot to talk about with this system, so please stay with me here. At the time, okay, the biggest thing that all the companies were doing was everything arcade, because when we went into the arcades were constantly evolving. It was sort of like getting a new iPhone or something like that. If you wanted to see the newest, greatest graphics, sound, gameplay, whatever, you had to see it in the arcades. And so the Nintendos and the 8-bit systems, they couldn't replicate that as much. They were getting closer, but it was sort of just like a Nintendo-ish version of the game. And then Sega Genesis hit and our jaws dropped on the floor. It was one of the very first 16-bit systems that we ever played, my friends, cousins, family, when I say we. And my cousins had it before me, and they called me up immediately, and they go, "You've got to see this Sega Genesis thing," right? And it came with Altered Beast. Why did it come with Altered Beast? Because all of the corporate big cats sitting around the table said, we've got to make a video game system that can bring the arcade to the home. If we bring the arcade to the home, we will get the kids, we will get the players, we will get people to buy the system more. Because as kids, we didn't have a lot of money to just dump in the arcades all the time. And you got to remember that after a while, arcades started costing 50 cents, 2 quarters instead of 1. So they were really draining us pretty bad. And that is why the Sega Genesis came with Altered Beast. Now, it only came with one controller. The controller, we actually called it the Batman controller at the time because it sort of looked like the Batwing in a way, I guess. I don't know, but that's just what it's called. And it had 3 buttons on it, which at least was better than 2 buttons. But hear me out. It seems as though all the developers, because they were smart, they developed the games around the 3 buttons as much as they possibly could. They developed it for 3 buttons, where it seemed like the other systems, they were games or they were arcade games that had more than 2 buttons, and they're trying to just figure out some funky way to implement them in. So as much as I want to say that 3 isn't enough, Sega did come out with a 6-button controller later on, and then it was problem solved, because then all the developers for the Sega Genesis, I noticed, were developing their games either around one controller or the 6-button or both. Now, I had the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo at the same time, even though the Sega Genesis came out before it. And there were some great games that I did play on it even before Super Nintendo, such as Ghouls and Ghosts was amazing. There you go again, another arcade game. It's almost picture perfectly a copy of the arcade. It's very close. And there's other great things, there's other great games about it too that I want to get into, but the point is that I had both systems. So when I was playing legendary titles on the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis was always in the corner, it was always right next to it, and you could always take a break from those games and plug in some great Sega Genesis games. Now, whether one system is better than the other is debatable, but I think that it's debatable only just to the point where people just like to argue about things, because if you compare both systems, the Super Nintendo is clearly better than it. But the Sega Genesis has those specific games, okay, that can't be played on Super Nintendo, and it has a lot of them, and they're extremely good, and I want to talk about those ones right now. Number 1, Castlevania Bloodlines, totally underrated title. They did everything they could with this Sega Genesis. They took the blast processing, they took everything, the special effects and anything that they could do, and they maxed it out. You can see almost every single special effect that the Genesis can do in this one game, and it's just a good Castlevania game. That's all there is to it, and you cannot play it on anything else. Sega Genesis only for that one. Next is going to be Shining Force, and especially Shining Force 2, I think is the best game that I played on the whole system. That's my personal favorite right there. I played that game through again and again, like all through the course of my life, and I even just talking about it feel like picking it up and playing it again right now. It's that damn good. It's a strategy-based role-playing type game, but look at the story, look at the graphics, look at the cutscenes. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Look at how your characters develop, and they can eventually, halfway through the game, transform into completely different characters that are just like major upgraded versions of the last ones. I don't know why this game is so good, it just is, and it's something that you can never get on Super Nintendo. Now, everyone loves Sonic the Hedgehog, and of course I could suggest it, but I wasn't really a big fan of it. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I've been spoiled by Mario and Mario World, and if you can compare the two, sure, Sonic runs super fast and all that, but there was just more about Mario World that I like better. So I don't want to go too poo-poo on the Sonic the Hedgehog, because people are going to get mad. I know you love it, but I personally didn't love it. I looked at it and I was sort of just like, well, it's sort of Mario clone in a way, right? But let's get on to some better ones other than that, okay? Such as like Contra, for example, Contra Hardcore. It's a hard game, but damn, is that a good game also for the Sega Genesis. And what about Phantasy Star? Let me talk about that again, okay? Phantasy Star 2 was okay. There's a lot of fans of it. I found it very, very difficult, and I didn't much like that when you fought the enemies, there was no more backgrounds anymore. It was sort of just like a generic looking sort of computer screen void of just like black. I didn't like that, because the original game actually had real backgrounds. Well, boy, they fixed all of that. One of my favorites, okay, and people don't really even like it that much, is Phantasy Star 3. But I think it's better because they got the backgrounds, and it's such a weird story, Generations of Doom, and you would get married to princesses, and you would have sons, and then those sons would pick up the legacy, and the story would continue. I don't know, there's something about it. But of course, hands down, where they blew it out of the water, one of the late games to come out for the system, and talk about going out with a bang, is Phantasy Star 4. It's just meat and potatoes, people, okay? Like, we're talking everything. It's even got remixed soundtracks from the original Phantasy Star put into it in that Sega Genesis kind of sound chip way that just is perfect. And there's all the machines in it again, like the ice digger and the hovercraft and all that kind of stuff. The battle scenes are amazing. The game story is phenomenally good. It's one of the best role-playing stories that I've ever been in, aside from like Final Fantasy 2 or 3 or whatever. It's right up there. It's a crazy good game. Has to be part of anyone's collection even if you haven't played it and you're a fan of nostalgia. It's Phantasy Star 4 all the way. There's also something about the Sega Genesis sound chip that's really nostalgic for me, even more so than Super Nintendo. I don't know what it is about it. It's like the tinniness of it, or the it's really, really hard to put a finger on unless you're older like me and you know what I'm talking about. Certain soundtracks, and one of the major ones for me would be Streets of Rage. When you turn it on for the very first time, and you hear that title, you hear the title music, right? And then you hear the beating of the bass and everything on stage 1. There is something about that just makes me feel like I'm 12 or 13. I can't even remember how old I was when I played it, but yeah, that one really takes me back. So there are certain things about it. There's certain things about the sound chip specifically with the Sega Genesis that really takes me back. So now we're reaching the conclusion about the Sega Genesis, aka Mega Drive. They did come out with a newer version of it later on. It was kind of slimmed down, and I don't think it had that funky headphone jack and volume thing on it, which is, kind of a neat little quirk amongst the system, because no other system had that. And you couldn't, everything's got headphone jacks on it today. People may think that that's not weird, but back in the day, you couldn't just plug your headphones into your TV, or you would have to have this massive elaborate stereo system. No kid had that, okay? That was like reserved for like parents and in the living room type of deal. So in order to plug actual headphones into the system and play the game without disturbing people in the middle of the night, or maybe your sister or brother who slept in the same room with you, was quite innovative for the time. And then what they did was Sega killed the system and basically killed themselves by coming out with all the expansions for it. The 32X, the Sega CD, save those for other episodes. episodes, but that was the death of it. They didn't learn from what Atari did, and I don't understand why history has to repeat itself, and that's why we pretty much don't have Sega today. They should have looked and said, don't keep the system going. Don't try to stretch it and keep it going. You have to make a new system. You have to make a new system from scratch. Stop adding these things to it and trying to keep the original system going for too long, especially when other systems such as the PlayStation and everything like that were coming out and would just dominate it. So that's it. The Sega Genesis, always a really, really special place in my heart. A very, very special video game system that did change video game industry forever at that time. It was an amazing time, the golden era of video games. So thanks a lot, guys, for listening to me ramble on about my old ancient video game stories from an old man. And click the thumbs up if you did like it. And of course, if you want to see me talk about another great video game system or maybe not so great video game system, click over here. And if you want to subscribe, click over here, or you will wet the bed tonight.